The night was quiet, except for the cry of a lone coyote echoing across the plains. Out here, beneath the endless sweep of stars, the world felt both vast and suffocating, filled with the weight of untold stories and buried secrets. The wind carried the smell of dust and wood smoke, mingling with the distant clatter of horses restless in their stalls. In a land where men carved out their survival with grit and calloused hands, fate often struck hard, and it struck without mercy. She hadn't chosen this life. She hadn't chosen to leave her home behind, or to be handed over like cattle at an auction block. But when the money ran dry, when debts piled higher than haystacks in winter, her fate had been sealed by men who saw value in obedience, not in dreams. She was sold not for who she was, but for what she could provide: a body to warm a stranger's bed, and a silence to keep his troubles from spilling into the world. That was what they told her. That was the rule of the land. Yet as the wagon wheels rattled her closer to the ranch where her new life would begin, something inside her stirred like a stubborn flame refusing to be snuffed out. The man who waited for her was not what she expected. Folks in town called him the broken cowboy. They said he had been a rider once, strong and untouchable. But war had left its mark on him, stealing not only his strength, but his joy. His eyes, shadowed and weary, carried storms he never spoke about. His hands bore scars from battles with men and with himself. They whispered that he was dangerous, that he drank to forget, that he had no room left in his heart for kindness. Yet when she first met his gaze, standing on the porch of that weather-worn cabin with lantern lights spilling across his face, she saw something different. Not cruelty, not desire. Something else, something harder to define. He didn't reach for her the way other men might. He didn't take her hand or pull her close as though she were already his to command. Instead, he studied her as though he wanted to read every fear she carried, every question she dared not speak. "I don't want obedience," he said quietly, almost as if he were talking more to himself than to her. "I want you." The words hung heavy in the night air, carrying a weight she did not yet understand. She had been warned to keep her head down, to follow orders, to accept the life that had been forced upon her. But his words, his unexpected defiance of what was meant to be, lit something fierce in her chest. Could he mean it? Could a man beaten by loss and burdened by sorrow truly want her not as property, not as a shadow to his will, but as herself? She searched his face for an answer, but all she found was a silence deeper than the prairie night, a silence that carried both promise and danger. Inside the cabin, the air was warm with the glow of firelight. Rough wooden walls framed a simple life tools hanging neatly, books stacked in a corner, and a table worn smooth from years of use. It wasn't the cage she had expected, yet freedom, she knew, was not built from walls or fences. Freedom rested in choices, and choices were what had been stolen from her the moment she was sold. She clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, the weight of her future pressing down with every heartbeat. He poured water into a basin, his movements steady but distant, like a man haunted by 1,000 unseen chains. His silence wasn't cruel, but it was heavy, filling the room more than words ever could. She wanted to speak, to ask him why he had said those words, why he didn't demand what was already his by law and by coin. But the courage to do so hadn't yet found its way past her lips. Instead, she studied him just as he had studied her. There was strength in his shoulders, even bent as they were by pain. There was fire in his eyes, though dimmed, as though he guarded it too carefully to let it burn. And there was something else, something she could not name, hidden beneath the rough edges of a man the world had labeled broken. The night stretched on, and with it came the pull of questions neither of them dared to answer. She wondered if she was meant to heal him, or if she would only be swallowed by the weight of his wounds. He wondered if she could survive the ghosts he carried, or if she would flee like so many had before. Between them lay the distance of strangers, but also the unspoken truth that fate had bound their lives together. Whether either of them wanted it or not, outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and carrying with it the smell of rain. The storm was coming. She felt it in her bones, just as she felt the storm brewing inside this cabin. He glanced toward the window, then back at her, his jaw tight, his hands flexing as if he fought to hold back words that threatened to escape. She waited, her heart pounding, knowing whatever he said next could change everything. But the words never came. Instead, he turned away, leaving her caught between hope and fear. Between the weight of what had been forced upon her and the faint, flickering chance that this man, this broken cowboy, might see her as something more than the price she had been sold for. The silence deepened, the storm drew closer, and in that stillness, her fate remained suspended, teetering on the edge of something she could not yet name. And in that unfinished space between them, the story truly began. The storm rolled in heavy that night, clouds pressing low against the horizon as thunder growled like some restless beast. She lay awake on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling beams that creaked with the wind. The fire in the hearth had dimmed to embers, throwing shadows that stretched and flickered across the cabin walls. She could hear him moving in the other room, his boots scuffing against the floorboards. The low groan of a chair as he sat and rose again as if he carried too much weight to ever find rest. Every sound reminded her that she was no longer free, yet no matter how many times she repeated that truth to herself, his words still echoed louder words that had unsettled her more than chains ever could. He didn't want obedience. He wanted her. The thought kept her awake long after the storm began its work. She wondered what kind of man spoke such things, what kind of man turned away when he had every right not to. Men she had known before had always taken, never asked. They had demanded silence and service, nothing more. Yet he had chosen something different, something she could not yet trust. She turned on the mattress, pulling the quilt tighter as rain began to strike the window, each drop sharp against the glass. Sleep would not come, not here. Not now. Morning broke gray and damp. Mist curled across the fields, and the earth smelled of wet soil and pine. She stepped out of the cabin, her boots sinking slightly in the mud, and looked around at the ranch that was now her prisoner, perhaps her refuge. It was hard to tell. A worn fence stretched along the pasture, leaning like an old man who had stood too long. A few horses grazed with their heads low, tails swishing lazily at flies. Chickens pecked near the shed, scattering when the door creaked open behind her. He walked out carrying a bucket, his shirt damp at the collar, his hair untamed from the night. He didn't speak, only nodded in her direction before heading toward the well. She watched him move with quiet strength, scars on his arms catching the morning light, the lines of his shoulders taut under the weight of silence. She wanted to ask about the ranch, about the land, about who he had been before fate had broken him. But her tongue remained heavy, tied by caution. Later, she found herself inside the barn, running her hand along the rough wood of the stalls. Dust clung to the air, sweetened by the scent of hay. One of the horses, a dark bay with intelligent eyes, leaned its head toward her. She lifted her palm gently, and to her surprise, it pressed against her touch, as though it recognized something in her that even she did not know. She had never been close to horses, never had reason to be, but the warmth of the animal's breath against her hand stirred something soft in her. "You're not afraid?" His voice came from behind her, low but steady. She turned quickly, her heart jumping at the sight of him leaning against the barn door. His gaze flicked from her to the horse, then back again. Most would be, he's a stubborn one. She lowered her hand, stepping back, unsure if she had overstepped. "I didn't mean to intrude." He shook his head, his expression unreadable. "It's your home now. Go where you will." The words should have felt like freedom, yet they carried an edge of restraint, as though he himself did not believe them. Over the next days, she learned the rhythm of the place. He rose before dawn, working the land with a determination that bordered on punishment. He mended fences, tended stock, chopped wood, all without complaint, though his body often betrayed him. She saw the way his hands trembled when he thought no one watched, the way he pressed against his ribs after lifting too much, the way pain shadowed his face before he turned it away. He carried his burdens in silence, and she carried her questions the same. The town was a half-day's ride away, a place of gossip and barter, where news traveled faster than the river's current. She had heard the whispers before she ever set foot in. This cabin whispers of how he had come back from the war less than he had been, how drink and solitude had hollowed him out, how his family's ranch had become little more than a reminder of what he had lost. Some said he kept to himself because he had no patience for people anymore. Others claimed he was dangerous, quick to anger, broken in ways no woman could mend. Yet none of those words had prepared her for the quiet man she now saw. A man who worked until his skin was raw, but whose eyes softened when they landed on her, even if only for a moment. Still, the truth of her situation never loosened its grip. She had been sold, and the knowledge sat heavy on her chest. Her family's debts had vanished in exchange for her future, leaving her tethered to a man she barely knew. She wondered if he felt the same weight, or if he saw her only as a shadow of obligation. But then his words would return, stirring the silence again. He wanted her, not obedience. She replayed them in her mind until they became both a comfort and a curse. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in shades of fire, he sat on the porch sharpening a blade. She hesitated before joining him, her hands folded in her lap as the steady scrape of stone against steel filled the air. Finally, she asked the question that had been pressing on her for days. Why me? He didn't look up at first, only kept his slow, deliberate rhythm. When he finally lifted his gaze, his eyes were darker than the twilight gathering around them. It wasn't meant to be you. I never asked for this. His words cut through her like the blade in his hands. Sharp and unyielding. Her breath caught, but before she could retreat, he added softly, "But now that you're here, I have a choice. I can keep pretending I'm a man already buried, or I can see if there's still life left in me." That's why she sat in silence, the weight of his confession sinking deep. He was a man bound not only by scars but by choices yet to be made, and she was at the heart of them whether she wanted it or not. The thought frightened her. It also drew her closer, against every warning she had ever known. The days grew colder, the nights longer. Work became harder as autumn pressed closer to winter. Together they mended what could be saved, patching roofs, stacking wood, storing grain. She learned the language of the land, the steady patience it demanded. And in turn she learned the language of the man who walked beside her. He was not quick to speak, but his silences carried meaning. And she found herself listening to them as if they were words, yet shadows lingered. Sometimes at night she would hear him cry out in his sleep, caught in battles long past. Other times he would ride out alone before dawn and not return until darkness fell. His face drawn and his hands stained with something more than dirt. He never explained, and she never asked. But the distance between them grew sharper in those moments. She began to wonder what secrets he kept. What ghosts followed him into every room? She wondered, too, if those ghosts would one day turn on her. Still, when he returned to the cabin and his eyes fell on her, there was a gentleness there that she could not deny. It was as if he feared losing her before he had even begun to claim her, the storm that had threatened on that first. Night was nothing compared to the storm building between them now. It was a storm of unspoken words, of questions unanswered, of truths waiting in the dark. And as the wind carried the scent of winter across the plains, she knew one thing for certain whatever lay ahead, she was already bound to it. Bound not by the price that had been paid for her, but by the choice of a broken cowboy who said he wanted her, even if neither of them yet understood what that truly meant. The nights were growing colder still, and with them, the silence between them deepened, pressing heavier with each passing day. Something was coming. She could feel it in the shift of the air. In the restless way he watched the horizon, in the secrets he locked behind his eyes. And though she tried to steady herself, to be ready for whatever might come, she could not shake the feeling that when the storm finally broke, it would change everything forever. Winter crept in quietly, wrapping the land in frost and silence. The ranch felt smaller beneath the weight of the cold, the rooms tighter, the air heavier. Smoke curled from the chimney each morning, a lone ribbon against the pale sky, while the fields lay bare and lifeless. She had grown used to the rhythm of the place, yet the unease in her chest only grew. The cowboy remained steady in his work, but there were nights when he would disappear into the barn, lantern light flickering through the cracks until dawn. She would lie awake wondering what demons he fought out there, and whether they would one day come for her too. The conflict between them was not spoken, but it lived in every silence they shared. She wanted to trust him, to believe his words when he said he wanted her, not obedience. But trust did not come easily when her very life had been bartered away. Some nights she still dreamed of the voices that had sold her, the men counting coins as though she were no more than a mule or a sack of grain. She woke with her throat tight and her hands trembling, only to find him sitting in the chair by the door, eyes fixed on the darkness outside, as if he had been standing guard all along. He carried his own unrest. She saw it in the way he lingered by the window, watching the road that led to town. She noticed how his jaw tightened whenever hoofbeats echoed from far off, even if they were only the neighbor's cattlemen moving their herd. He never spoke of it, but she knew he feared someone might come, whether it was men from his past or the ones who had sold her into his hands. She could not tell. Yet the weight of it pressed between them, shaping every word left unspoken. One afternoon, while the snow still clung to the edges of the roof, he left for town with a wagon full of supplies. Hours stretched long in his absence, the cabin's quiet broken only by the crackle of the fire and the restless shifting of the horses outside. She took 2 mending clothes, though her stitches were clumsy, and 2 reading from one of the few worn books he kept on a shelf. But no task could keep her mind from wandering. She imagined him in town, standing at the saloon where men whispered his name, listening as they traded stories of his brokenness. Did he hear them? Did he care? And if he did, what did it mean for her? When he returned that evening, the wagon heavier than before, she noticed more than flour and salt tucked under the canvas. There was a rifle, newly oiled, and a box of cartridges. He carried them into the cabin without explanation, setting them near the hearth as if they belonged there. She said nothing, though her heart thudded in her chest. That night she asked softly, "Are you expecting trouble?" He looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "Out here, trouble doesn't send word before it comes. Better to be ready." His tone was calm, but his eyes betrayed the truth. Trouble was not just possible. It was certain. She wondered what kind of trouble a man like him drew, whether she had been brought into its path. The days dragged colder. With them came smaller conflicts that only fed the greater one. She longed for her own voice, for a place where she could decide her own steps. Yet each time she tried to carve a piece of freedom by taking a horse out alone, or by riding into the fields without telling him he would find her and bring her back, his face hard with fear. "You don't know what waits beyond," he told her once, his voice rough. "This land doesn't forgive the unguarded." She wanted to argue, but the truth of his concerns softened her anger. Still, the cage was there, even if it was lined with kindness. One evening, she found a stack of letters tucked away in a drawer, tied with twine. The paper was worn, the ink faded, but the words still clear enough to read. They spoke of battlefields and smoke, of brothers who did not return, of nights without light. She read only a few lines before the weight of his pain became too heavy to bear. She set them back, her hands shaking. She understood now why his silences were so thick, why his eyes carried storms. But she also understood something else. His past was not gone. It lived with him still, shaping every choice he made, every fear he carried. And it was not only his past that haunted them. Men in town began to ask questions. She heard it from a passing traveler who came to trade for feed one morning. The man's eyes lingered on her too long before he said, "Word is, she was bought and brought here. Folks are wondering if she's content or kept." She froze at his words, heat rising in her chest. The cowboy stepped between them, his voice low but sharp. "She's not your concern." The traveler chuckled and left. But the words had already sunk deep. That night she asked him, "What happens if they come here for me?" He looked at her as though the thought itself burned. "No one will take you," he said, his tone fierce, almost desperate. Yet even as he spoke, she saw the fear in his eyes. He could not control the whispers. He could not silence the world. The tension grew as winter deepened. More rifles appeared in the cabin, more long nights where he rode out alone. She began to sense that he was preparing for something larger than the land or the weather. Something from his past was moving closer, and she had been placed right in its path. At the same time, different conflicts stirred in her heart. The longer she lived under his roof, the harder it became to see him as the man she had been sold to. She saw instead the man who kept her safe, who left an extra blanket by her bed on the coldest nights, who watched her with eyes that begged for something he could not name. Yet the truth of her being sold remained like a scar. Could something born in chains ever turn into choice? Could love take root in soil poisoned by debt and silence? Her thoughts turned off into her family, to the ones who had traded her away. Did they think of her? Did they imagine she was living in comfort now, her debt paid, her life secured? Or had they already forgotten her, moving on without a second thought? The questions gnawed at her, deepening the ache that came whenever she looked toward the horizon. As snow covered the plains in white silence, the cabin became both haven and trap. She found herself walking its rooms like a restless ghost, her thoughts circling the same unanswerable questions. He watched her, sensing the distance between them grow. Sometimes he tried to close it with words, with a hand reaching out, with a quiet kindness. But other times he pulled away, his own ghost dragging him further from her reach. The main conflict was no longer only between them. It was around them, pressing closer with each day. The whispers in town, the shadows of his past, the men who might come to reclaim what they believed was theirs. Every choice they made seemed to draw them tighter into a web neither had spun, yet both were caught in. And though the fire still burned in the hearth each night, knew it was only a fragile light against the darkness that threatened to swallow them whole. The nights grew longer, the silence heavier, and as she lay awake listening to the wind tear across the plains, she wondered not if the storm would break, but when. The cold deepened, settling into the bones of the land until every sound seemed sharper, every shadow stretched longer. Days shortened, and nights came heavy with silence, broken only by the crack of branches in the wind or the low rumble of coyotes too close to the fence line. The cabin glowed like a small lantern against the darkness, but inside, tension grew stronger than the storms outside. Every glance between them carried unspoken questions, and every silence felt like it held a warning neither of them dared to speak. Loud whispers from town reached them even in the stillness of winter. A ranch hand delivering feed muttered about men asking too many questions at the saloon. Strangers had been seen riding through, stopping for a drink, and leaving before the sun rose again. The cowboy's shoulders stiffened each time the subject was raised, but he said little. His silence did not comfort her. It only confirmed what she already sensed, that someone was coming, and when they did, the fragile safety of this place would be tested. She tried to push down her fear by clinging to the routine of the ranch. She rose early to help with the horses, learned to carry buckets from the well, even managed to stitch repairs into worn clothes. Yet none of it could keep her thoughts from circling the truth. She had been sold into this life, and her presence here was not by choice. That wound had never healed, and now it throbbed with fresh pain. If men came to claim her again, what power did she have to stop them? She had been powerless before, and though the cowboy spoke fiercely of keeping her safe, she feared even he could not stand against the weight of the world pressing down on them. One night, she woke to the sound of the door opening. The cold air rushed in, and she saw him slipping outside with the rifle slung across his back. Lantern light flickered briefly before vanishing into the night. She sat up, torn between staying put and following. The silence gnawed at her until she wrapped herself in a shawl and stepped into the darkness. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she followed the faint glow of the lantern. Across the pasture, she found him at the far edge of the property, standing by the fence with the lantern low at his side. His breath came in sharp clouds, his jaw tight as he stared toward the hills. She looked too, and though the night was thick, she thought she saw movement, a dark shape against the snow, pausing just long enough to be seen before vanishing again into the trees. Her chest tightened. Whoever they were close. When he noticed her, his eyes burned with frustration. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice sharp, though beneath it was fear. "I heard something," she whispered. His grip tightened on the rifle. "So did they." He didn't explain who he meant, but she knew. The ones watching from the shadows. The ones waiting. From that night on, he kept the rifle within reach at all times. He double-checked the locks, stacked firewood higher by the door, and left lanterns burning longer than before. She felt the walls close tighter around them with each precaution. And though she wanted to believe they were safe, she knew the truth. Safety was slipping away, step by step, night by night. Tension between them only grew. She longed for answers, for him to tell her the truth about the men who haunted his past, about why her presence drew such danger. But each time she asked, his silence stood like a wall she could not climb. He carried his ghosts alone, and it was driving a wedge between them that neither could ignore. She wanted to trust him, wanted to believe in the promise of his words, yet doubt sank its claws deeper each day. The breaking point came when another stranger arrived at the ranch. A man in a long coat rode up just as the sun was setting, his horse kicking snow against the fence. He called out, his voice carrying across the yard, asking for directions. But there was something in his tone that made her shiver, a practiced politeness hiding something sharper. The cowboy stepped out onto the porch, his stance rigid, his hand never straying far from the rifle leaning by the door. The conversation was brief, words traded low and tense. And when the stranger finally rode off, she saw the worry etched deep into the cowboy's face. That night, she pressed him for answers. Who was he? He hesitated, then admitted what she had feared. Not just a traveler. Men like him don't ride this far unless they're looking for something. Or someone. Her heart dropped. Me. He didn't deny it. The truth hung between them like a blade. She had been found, or nearly so, in the days that followed. The ranch felt less like a home and more like a battlefield waiting for its fight. She noticed how he studied the horizon, how he kept the horses saddled, as if ready to leave at a moment's notice. She, too, began to prepare in her own quiet ways, packing a small bundle of clothes, tucking away food where it might be grabbed quickly. But the question haunted her. Where would they run if the men came? And could running even save them? The conflict between her heart and her fear grew sharper. Against every warning, against every memory of how she had arrived here, she had begun to care for him. Not just because he had spoken words that gave her hope, but because she saw the man behind the scars. She saw how he fought against his past, how he tried to build something out of the ruins of his life, even if the world mocked him as broken. But caring for him meant sharing his dangers, and that was a weight she wasn't sure she could bear. The final push toward the storm came late one evening. The fire had burned low, and she sat mending a tear in her shawl when a sharp knock rattled the door. They both froze, eyes meeting across the room. The knock came again, louder, followed by a voice calling his name. He rose slowly, reaching for the rifle, his face pale but set with resolve. She stood too, her knees weak, the air heavy with the sense that whatever waited beyond that door would decide everything. The voice outside grew more insistent, calling not just for him, but for her as well. Her heart pounded, her breath shallow. She looked at him, searching for reassurance, but saw only the storm in his eyes. He motioned for her to stay back. Lifting the rifle with steady hands as he moved toward the door, the knock turned into a pounding. The voice outside sharpened, demanding, no longer pretending to be polite. She pressed a hand to her chest, her mind racing. This was the moment everything had been leading to, the whispers, the shadows, the fear coiled tighter each day. Whoever stood outside had come with purpose, and that purpose was her. The cowboy paused at the door, his hand hovering near the latch. The room was silent but for the pounding of her heart. The crackle of the dying fire, the storm of snow beating against the windows. She knew the next moment would change everything, and still the door remained closed. The suspense thick as the winter night, the pounding on the door seemed to last forever. Each strike against the wood echoing through the small cabin like a drumbeat of fate. She stood frozen by the hearth, clutching the shawl around her shoulders, her breath caught tight in her chest. The cowboy's hand hovered near the latch, the rifle balanced firmly in his grip. For a long moment, he didn't move. He just listened, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark with storms that had lived in him far longer than this night. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but steady. "Stay behind me." The words were not a request, but a vow. As if he had already decided that whatever waited on the other side of that door would not take her easily. The latch lifted, and the door swung open to reveal 3 men standing in the snow. Their coats were heavy, their hats pulled low, and their eyes sharp with hunger that had nothing to do with food. The leader stepped forward, boots crunching against the frozen ground. "We've come for what belongs to us," he said, his voice rough. The girl, her blood turned cold, though the fire still burned behind her. She wanted to speak, to shout that she was not theirs, that she was not anyone's to claim, but her throat closed. The cowboy's rifle lifted. The barrel steady, though his body carried the weight of old scars. "She's not yours," he said. His tone was calm, but beneath it burned something fierce. "She's not property. Not anymore." The men exchanged looks, laughter rolling from one of them like smoke. "You bought her," the leader said, his lips curling into something cruel. "Paid her debt with coin. And now you want to pretend you're better than the rest of us?" He didn't flinch. "I don't pretend. I've buried enough to know the worth of a life." "She stays." For a moment, no one moved. The wind whistled through the trees, the horses outside shifted nervously, and the fire popped in the silence. Then, like the snap of a whip, the standoff broke. One of the men lunged forward, hand reaching for his gun, and in that heartbeat, the cowboy fired. The crack split the night, and chaos erupted. The fight that followed was not graceful, nor was it swift. It was raw, desperate, and filled with the kind of fear that only comes when everything you love hangs by a thread. She screamed once, ducking behind the table as bullets tore into the wooden frame of the cabin. The cowboy stood his ground, firing again and again, moving with a determination that made him seem larger than the broken man he had been called. When it ended, silence fell heavy. The snow outside was stained, the intruders either gone into the dark or lying still where they had fallen. The cowboy leaned against the doorframe, his chest heaving, his hands trembling as the rifle slipped from his grip. She rushed to him, catching his weight before he collapsed. "You're hurt," she whispered. Seeing the blood at his side, he shook his head, though his voice was weak. "I'll live. We both will." In the days that followed, the ranch carried the weight of what had happened. The bodies had been buried far beyond the fence line, the tracks covered by drifting snow. The town whispered again, but the whispers changed. They spoke of the cowboy who had stood against the men who thought they owned everything. They spoke of the woman who had not been taken, who remained at his side. For once, the whispers did not carry shame. They carried something closer to respect. She tended to his wounds, watching over him as he healed slowly. In those quiet hours, she found herself speaking more freely than she ever had. She told him of her family, of the night she had been sold, of the hollow ache that had followed her every step since. He listened, truly listened, never interrupting, never judging. And when she finished, he looked at her with eyes that held no pity, only understanding. "I can't change how you came here," he said softly, "but I can promise you'll never be sold again. You're free now. If you want to go, I won't stop you." The words broke something inside her, not with pain, but with release. No one had ever given her choice before. No one had ever said she could be free. And yet, as the offer hung in the air, she realized she did not want to leave. Freedom, she understood, was not always about walking away. Sometimes it was about choosing to stay. Spring came slowly, melting the snow into rivers that cut through the fields. The land began to stir again, green pushing through the brown. Together, they worked to rebuild what winter and conflict had threatened to destroy. The fences stood straighter, the barn grew stronger, and with each day, the bond between them deepened. He was still a man of silence, still burdened by scars she could not see, but he was no longer only the broken cowboy. He was something more, and with him, she found she was something more as well. She was no longer the girl sold to warm his bed, no longer the shadow of debts unpaid. She was herself, stronger, braver. And finally, unafraid to take up space in a world that had once tried to erase her at night. They sat on the porch together, watching the sun sink behind the hills. Sometimes he spoke of his past, the battles that had shaped him, the men he had lost. Other times they sat in silence, but it was no longer heavy silence. It was peace. And as the stars returned, endless and bright, she knew their story had not ended in chains or in blood. It had begun there, yes, but it had grown into something neither of them had expected. The world would still whisper, as it always did. There would always be those who judged, who believed a person's worth could be measured in coins or in scars. But here, on this land, in this life they had carved from the dust and the cold, they had found something stronger than whispers. They had found choice. They had found love. The broken cowboy who once said he did not want obedience had been right all along. He wanted her not as a possession, not as a shadow of debt, but as herself. And she, who had once believed freedom was beyond her reach, discovered it in the simplest of truths, that in choosing each other they had both been set free. The ranch stood quiet under the wide sky, the wind carrying the scent of earth and pine, the promise of new seasons ahead. And in that quiet, side by side, they finally understood what it meant to belong not to the world, not to those who sought to own them, but to each other. Their story, born in hardship and shadow, ended not in fear but in the steady warmth of a fire that would not burn out.